I was 67 years old when my son left me on the side of a road in the middle of a storm because of something I didn't do, and as his taillights disappeared into the rain, I remember thinking not about the cold or the dark, but about how easily love can be rewritten into something unrecognizable when the wrong voice speaks loud enough. The rain came down in heavy sheets, the kind that blurs everything into shadows and motion, and within seconds my coat was soaked through, clinging to my skin as if it too had decided I didn't belong anywhere warm anymore. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, staring at the empty stretch of highway, half expecting the car to slow down, to stop, to reverse, but it didn't, and the silence that followed felt louder than the storm itself. 24 hours earlier, everything had still looked normal, or at least the kind of normal you learn to accept when tension lives quietly in the background of every conversation. That morning, I had woken up early, just after 6, the way I always do, and made coffee in my son Daniel's kitchen while the house was still asleep, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound keeping me company. I remember looking out at the backyard, at the neat line of hedges Rachel insisted on trimming every Sunday, and thinking how different this house felt compared to the one I had raised Daniel in, where laughter used to echo down the hallway without permission. Rachel came down a little after 7, already dressed, already composed, her voice polite but distant as she greeted me, the kind of politeness that builds walls instead of bridges. She thanked me for making coffee but didn't drink it, setting the mug aside as if even accepting something from me required too much effort. Daniel followed shortly after, distracted, his attention divided between his phone and whatever schedule he carried in his head, and when he smiled at me, it felt brief, like a habit rather than a feeling. We had planned the drive days in advance, a simple trip, just a few hours out to visit family, something I had hoped might bring us closer, or at least soften whatever distance had grown between us over the years. I packed snacks, folded a blanket, small things that used to matter, gestures that once meant care, though now they seemed to go unnoticed. As we got into the car, Rachel took the front seat without a word, and I slid into the back, watching them from behind as if I were already a guest in a story that used to belong to me. The sky had been gray even then, heavy with the promise of rain, but nothing about that morning warned me of what was coming, not the quiet, not the glances, not even the way Rachel's voice would later change, sharp and certain, as if she had been waiting for the right moment to say something that would alter everything. If I had known, I might have paid closer attention, might have noticed the way Daniel avoided looking at me for too long, or how Rachel's silence carried something deliberate inside it, but I didn't, and by the time the storm finally arrived, it was already too late for anything to be undone. The first drop of rain hit the windshield just outside the city limits, a soft tap that quickly turned into a steady rhythm, and by the time we reached the open highway, the sky had darkened enough to make the afternoon feel like early evening. I watched the road through the space between the front seats, the lines stretching forward and disappearing under the tires, and I remember thinking how quiet the car had become, not the comfortable kind of silence that comes with familiarity, but something heavier, something that seemed to wait for the right moment to break. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice calm but carrying a sharp edge beneath it, the kind that does not need to be loud to be heard. She asked Daniel if he had noticed anything missing from the house that morning, her tone almost casual, as if she were bringing up something small, something easily explained. Daniel glanced at her, then back at the road, his hands tightening slightly on the steering wheel, and said no, that everything seemed fine. I could feel the shift before I fully understood it, the way the air inside the car seemed to thin, the way Rachel turned just enough in her seat so that her words would reach me clearly. She said that her bracelet was gone, the one her mother had given her years ago, and that she had last seen it on the kitchen counter, right next to where I had been standing earlier that morning. For a second, I thought she was asking if I had seen it, a simple question with a simple answer, and I opened my mouth to respond, but she did not wait. She said it must have been taken, that no one else had been in the house, and then she said my name in a way that made it sound unfamiliar, as if it did not belong to me anymore. I felt something inside my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the sudden understanding that this was not a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared, it was something already decided. I told her I had not seen the bracelet, that I would never take anything that was not mine, and I kept my voice steady, the way I had learned to do over the years when emotions threatened to rise too quickly. Daniel did not turn around, did not ask me a single question, did not even hesitate long enough for doubt to exist. He asked Rachel if she was sure, and when she said yes, he nodded once, as if that was all the confirmation he needed. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof now, filling the space where conversation should have been, and I watched as Rachel leaned back in her seat, her expression calm again, almost relieved, as if something had finally been set into motion. I tried to think of what to say, something that would reach Daniel, something that would remind him of who I was beyond this moment, but the words stayed somewhere inside me, caught between disbelief and the quiet realization that he was no longer listening. The car slowed slightly, just enough for me to notice, and then it pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as the storm closed in around us. Daniel did not turn off the engine right away, and for a moment the car idled on the shoulder as the rain pounded harder against the windows, each drop blurring the outside world into streaks of gray and white, and I could see his reflection faintly in the rearview mirror, his jaw set, his eyes focused somewhere ahead that did not include me. Rachel was the one who broke the silence again, her voice softer now, almost disappointed, as if the situation had become inconvenient rather than serious, and she said she did not feel comfortable continuing the trip with someone she could not trust sitting behind her. The words settled in the car like something final, something that did not invite discussion, and I felt the space around me shrink, as if there was no longer room for anything but what she had already decided. I leaned forward slightly, my hands resting on the back of Daniel's seat, and I said his name quietly, not in protest, not in anger, but in the same tone I had used when he was a child and needed to be reminded of something important, something simple, something true. He did not look back. He just took a breath, slow and controlled, and then he said that it would be better if I stepped out for a while, that we all needed time to think, that this was not the right environment to sort things out. His words were measured, almost reasonable, and that made them harder to argue with, because they sounded like logic instead of rejection. I asked him where I was supposed to go, my voice still steady, still calm, even as the storm outside seemed to press closer against the glass. He said there was a gas station a few miles back, that I could call someone, that I would be fine, and then he finally glanced at me in the mirror, just for a second, not long enough to read anything beyond a flicker of discomfort that disappeared as quickly as it came. Rachel did not say anything more. She simply adjusted her seatbelt and looked forward, her posture relaxed, as if the hardest part of her day was already behind her. I sat there for another moment, letting the weight of what was happening settle into something I could carry without breaking, and then I reached for the door handle. The sound of the door opening was louder than I expected, a sharp interruption against the steady rhythm of the rain, and the cold air rushed in immediately, wrapping around me with a kind of indifference that felt almost familiar. I stepped out carefully, my shoes sinking slightly into the wet gravel, and I closed the door behind me with more gentleness than the moment deserved. For a brief second, I stood beside the car close enough that I could still see the outline of my son through the rain-streaked window, close enough that he could have said something, anything, that might have changed what came next. But he did not. The brake lights flickered, the car shifted forward, and then it was gone, swallowed by the storm and the distance, leaving me alone on the side of the road with nothing but the sound of rain and the quiet understanding that some decisions, once made, do not come back for you. The rain did not let up after the car disappeared, it only grew steadier, heavier, as if the sky had settled into its decision the same way my son had, without hesitation and without looking back, and within minutes my hair was soaked through, water running down the back of my neck and into my collar, cold in a way that made every movement feel slower, more deliberate, as if I had to think about each step before I took it. I moved a few feet away from the edge of the road, not because it felt safer, but because standing exactly where he had left me began to feel like waiting, and I understood even then that waiting was no longer an option I could afford. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights cutting through the rain in brief flashes before fading into the distance, none of them slowing, none of them noticing the small figure standing off to the side of the highway, and I realized how easy it is to become invisible when no one is looking for you. I wrapped my arms around myself, more out of habit than comfort, and looked down the road in the direction we had been heading, trying to remember how far the next town might be, trying to place myself on a map that suddenly felt unfamiliar even though I had traveled it before. The wind picked up in uneven bursts, pushing the rain sideways so that it stung against my face, and I turned slightly to shield my eyes, blinking against the water as I tried to keep my thoughts clear. I told myself to focus on what could be done, not on what had already happened, because there was nothing in that moment that could be undone, not the words, not the silence that followed, not the choice that had been made without me. I checked my pockets out of instinct, even though I already knew what I would find: a handkerchief, a few dollars folded neatly, and nothing else. No phone, no way to call anyone, no simple solution waiting to be discovered. For a brief moment, I thought about walking back the way we had come, about finding that gas station Daniel had mentioned, but the distance felt uncertain, stretched by the storm into something longer than it should have been, and I knew that guessing wrong could leave me further from help instead of closer to it. So I stayed where I was, choosing stillness over the risk of moving blindly, and listened to the sound of the rain as it filled the empty space around me, steady and relentless, like a clock marking time in a place where time did not seem to matter anymore. And in that stillness, something shifted inside me, not loud, not sudden, but quiet and certain, the understanding that whatever came next would not be about proving anything to them, not about explaining or defending or asking to be believed, but about finding a way forward that did not depend on whether they chose to see me or not, because standing there in the storm, with nothing but the road stretching out in both directions, I realized that being left behind had already answered a question I had not known I was asking. Time passed in a strange way after that, not measured in minutes or miles, but in the rhythm of the rain and the slow, steady effort it took to remain standing without giving in to the weight of everything pressing down around me, and I began to notice small things, details that would have gone unnoticed on any other day: the uneven gravel beneath my shoes, the distant hum of tires on wet pavement, the way the air smelled faintly of asphalt and damp earth, grounding me in a reality that felt both harsh and oddly clear. I kept my eyes on the road, not expecting anything, but not turning away either, because there was a quiet understanding forming inside me that movement, any movement, would come from outside before it came from within. Another car passed, then another, each one a brief possibility that vanished as quickly as it appeared, and I did not raise my hand, did not step closer to the edge, because something in me resisted the idea of asking to be seen by strangers when I had just been dismissed by my own family. Instead, I stood still, letting the storm move around me, letting the cold settle into something I could manage rather than something I needed to fight. It was not until I heard a different sound, softer, slower, that I realized one of the headlights approaching was not rushing past like the others. The vehicle reduced its speed gradually, tires crunching lightly against the wet shoulder as it came to a stop several yards ahead of me, its brake lights glowing red through the rain like a quiet signal rather than a sudden interruption. For a moment, nothing happened, and I remained where I was, watching, not moving closer, not retreating, simply observing the way the driver's door opened and a figure stepped out, holding an umbrella that tilted slightly against the wind. The person did not call out immediately, did not rush toward me, but instead walked at a measured pace, as if understanding that urgency can sometimes feel like pressure, and when they finally spoke, their voice was calm, steady, and carried just enough to reach me without forcing itself into my space. They asked if I was all right, a simple question, one that did not assume anything, one that left room for me to answer in my own time, and I realized how different it felt to be asked rather than accused. I nodded at first, out of habit, the automatic response that comes from years of saying you are fine even when you are not, but then I stopped, because something about the moment did not require that kind of protection. I took a small step forward, closing part of the distance between us, and said that I had been left behind, that I did not have a phone, that I was trying to figure out what to do next, and the words came out evenly, without bitterness, without urgency, simply as facts. The person listened without interrupting, without offering quick solutions or empty reassurances, and when I finished, they nodded once, as if acknowledging not just what I had said, but what it meant. They offered me a ride, not with insistence, but with quiet certainty, explaining that the nearest town was about 8 miles ahead, that there would be a place to sit, to warm up, to decide the next step from somewhere that was not the side of a highway in the rain, and I stood there for a moment, considering the offer, not because I doubted them, but because I understood that accepting help is sometimes the hardest decision to make when you have just been taught how easily trust can be misplaced. Then I stepped forward fully into the space beneath the umbrella, and for the first time since the car had driven away, I felt something shift that was not about loss, but about possibility, quiet and fragile, but real enough to follow. The interior of the car felt warmer than I expected, not just from the heater that hummed quietly as I settled into the passenger seat, but from the simple fact that I was no longer standing alone in the rain, and for a few moments I said nothing, listening instead to the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers as they cleared the glass in slow, consistent arcs that seemed to restore order to something that had just been chaos. The driver did not rush to fill the silence, did not ask unnecessary questions, and I found myself appreciating that restraint more than any words of comfort could have offered, because it allowed me to gather my thoughts without feeling observed or examined. After a short distance, they adjusted the temperature slightly, directing more warm air toward me, a small gesture that felt deliberate without being intrusive, and I realized how long it had been since someone had considered my comfort without expecting something in return. We drove for several minutes before they spoke again, asking where I had been heading before everything changed, and I gave a brief answer, explaining the family visit that had turned into something else entirely, leaving out the details that still felt too recent to explain without unraveling. They nodded as if that was enough, as if they understood that not every story needs to be told all at once, and then they mentioned that the town ahead was about 8 miles away, that there was a diner open late and a small motel nearby, places where I could sit, think, and decide what came next without the pressure of being watched or judged. I looked out the window as the landscape shifted from empty highway to scattered lights in the distance, the faint outline of buildings appearing through the rain like something slowly returning to focus, and I felt a quiet sense of grounding, not because the situation had changed, but because I had moved from being stranded to being in motion again. It was then, in that calm, steady space between where I had been and where I was going, that the driver glanced at me briefly and said my name, not as a question, but with a certainty that made me turn toward them fully for the first time. I studied their face more closely, noticing the familiar lines, the way their expression held both recognition and restraint, and something in my memory began to surface, slow at first, like a reflection emerging through fog. They said it had been a long time, that they were not sure if I would remember, and as they spoke, pieces began to align, a moment from years ago, a conversation I had almost forgotten, something small that had not seemed important at the time but had stayed with someone else far longer than I realized. I felt my breath catch slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that this was not a random encounter, that the person who had stopped in the storm had not done so by chance alone, and I realized then that the world does not always return what you give in the moment you expect it, but sometimes, quietly and without warning, it brings it back when you need it most. The recognition did not come all at once, it unfolded slowly, like a memory that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to return, and as I looked at him more closely, the years seemed to fall away in small pieces, revealing a younger face beneath the one I saw now, a boy standing uncertainly in my doorway on a winter evening long ago, his hands shoved into the pockets of a worn jacket, his voice hesitant as he asked if I remembered him. I had not at first, but he had reminded me, gently, explaining that he had been Daniel's friend in high school, the quiet one who used to come over after classes, the one who never stayed long but always said, "Thank you" before leaving, and when he said his name now, it settled into place with a clarity that surprised me. His name was Thomas, and I remembered then how thin he had been back then, how careful, how he would linger just a little longer than necessary in the warmth of our kitchen before stepping back out into whatever waited for him beyond our door. I had never asked too many questions, but I had noticed the way he ate when I offered food, the way he accepted small kindnesses as if they were larger than they seemed, and I had simply made sure there was always something available for him without making it feel like charity. Now, sitting beside him in the car as the storm continued outside, I saw not the boy he had been, but the man he had become, steady, composed, carrying a quiet confidence that did not need to be announced. He told me that he had recognized me almost immediately, that he had not been certain at first because of the rain and the distance, but something about the way I stood, the way I held myself even in that moment, had felt familiar enough for him to slow down, to take a second look, to stop. I listened without interrupting, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something deeper than coincidence, something that felt like a thread connecting past and present in a way I had not expected. He said that there were things people do that they forget about, small acts that seem ordinary at the time, but for someone else, they become something lasting, something that shapes how they see the world, and as he spoke, I realized that whatever I had offered him all those years ago had stayed with him in a way I had never intended, not because it was extraordinary, but because it had been given without condition. The town lights grew closer as he spoke, reflecting off the wet pavement in long streaks of color, and I felt a quiet shift inside me, not just relief at being out of the storm, but something steadier, something that reminded me that the story I had been living in for the past few hours was not the only one that existed. There were other versions of me, other moments, other connections that had not been erased by what had just happened, and as Thomas guided the car off the highway and toward the small cluster of buildings ahead, I understood that being seen, truly seen, does not always come from the people you expect, but when it does arrive, it carries with it a kind of clarity that no accusation can take away. The diner was nearly empty when we stepped inside, the soft chime above the door marking our entrance in a way that felt almost gentle after the noise of the storm, and the warmth wrapped around me immediately, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that had been waiting without urgency. I paused just inside the doorway for a brief moment, aware of the contrast between where I had been and where I was now, the sound of rain fading behind me as the quiet hum of conversation and clinking dishes took its place. Thomas did not rush me, did not guide me forward or fill the silence with instructions. He simply walked beside me at a pace that matched mine, allowing me to move from one space into another without feeling displaced. We chose a booth near the window, where the glass still carried streaks of rain that caught the light from outside, and I slid into the seat slowly, noticing how my hands trembled slightly now that I was no longer focused on staying upright against the wind. A waitress approached with a polite smile, offering coffee without asking too many questions, and I nodded, grateful for something simple, something familiar that did not require explanation. The cup warmed my hands as I held it, the heat grounding me in a way I had not realized I needed, and for a few minutes neither of us spoke, allowing the quiet to settle into something comfortable rather than strained. It was Thomas who eventually broke the silence, not with questions about what had happened in detail, but with a simple observation that sometimes people reveal more about themselves in a single moment than they do in years, and that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I looked down at the surface of the coffee, watching the faint ripples settle, and I understood what he meant, not just about Daniel, but about everything that had led to that point, the small shifts, the overlooked signs, the way I had adjusted myself over time to fit into a space that had slowly stopped making room for me. I did not defend them, did not try to explain Rachel or soften what had been done, because in that moment, there was nothing left to protect, and I realized that clarity does not always come with anger, sometimes it arrives quietly, leaving you with nothing but the truth and the choice of what to do with it. Thomas listened, not as someone waiting to respond, but as someone who understood the weight of what was not being said, and when I finished, he nodded once, as if acknowledging something that did not need to be repeated. Outside, the rain had begun to ease, the steady downpour softening into a lighter rhythm, and I found myself noticing it without urgency, without the need to measure how much time had passed or how far I had come, because for the first time since the car had stopped on the side of the road, I was no longer thinking about where I had been left, but about where I could go next, and that shift, small as it was, felt more significant than anything that had happened before. By the time the coffee had cooled enough to drink without thinking about it, I had already made a decision that did not feel dramatic or rushed, but quiet and steady, like something that had been forming long before that day and had simply waited for the right moment to become clear. I did not reach for my phone because I did not have one, and even if I had, I knew I would not have called Daniel, not yet, not while the memory of that moment on the side of the road was still too close, too sharp to be softened by explanations or apologies that had not yet been earned. Instead, I asked the waitress for a pen and a small piece of paper, and I wrote down a few things I would need to take care of, practical steps, simple actions, the kind that move you forward without asking for permission from anyone else. Thomas watched without interrupting, understanding that sometimes the most important part of moving on is not what you say, but what you choose to do next, and when I finished, I folded the paper carefully and placed it in my coat pocket, as if securing something more than just a list. Outside, the rain had slowed to a light drizzle, the kind that leaves the world washed clean without drawing attention to itself, and the reflections in the pavement had softened, no longer sharp or distorted, but calm and steady, mirroring the shift I felt within myself. Thomas offered to help me find a place to stay for the night, to make sure I had what I needed, and I accepted, not out of helplessness, but because I understood now that accepting support does not diminish strength, it reveals a different kind of it. As we stood to leave, I glanced once more at the window, at the road beyond it, and I realized that the place where I had been left no longer held the same weight it had before, not because it had changed, but because I had. Somewhere out there, Daniel was still driving, still holding on to a version of events that had been handed to him without question, and one day, he would have to face the space between what he believed and what was true, but that moment did not belong to me anymore. I did not need to stand in that space waiting for him to see it, to understand it, to regret it, because my path had already shifted away from that need. As we stepped back outside, the air felt different, lighter, carrying the faint scent of rain that was beginning to fade, and I walked beside Thomas toward the car with a sense of direction that had not been there before, not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after, and you do not always recognize them when they happen, but sometimes, standing in the quiet that follows, you realize that what was taken from you was never as defining as what you chose to carry forward. And as I opened the car door and settled into the seat once more, I understood that being left behind had not ended my story. It had simply revealed a different beginning, one that did not depend on being chosen by others, but on choosing myself without hesitation.